I'm
I
ready.
have the, okay, thank you. Well, good evening, everyone. Time to start, so I'm going to go ahead and begin. First, this program is being recorded, so if you have to leave early for any reason, or if you know of someone who wasn't able to make it, even though they signed up, um, that it should be available later for viewing and maybe even be put on YouTube. We will not be having any breaks, but you may come and go as you please. Just remember to mute your mic if you leave, if it isn't already muted. Hey, my name is Sue Fabish, and I'm a volunteer with Compassionate Choices Iowa. For those of you who are not available with Compassionate Choices, it's a nonprofit organization in the US dedicated to defending patient autonomy and personal choice at the end of life. Whereas its original focus had been to expand access to medical aid in dying for the terminally ill, it has been expanding its attention to all end of life concerns. It's made up of people who accept the inevitability of death and look at all options when it comes to compassionate death and encourages individuals to choose end of life care that fits their values, priorities, and beliefs. CNC offers resources on end of life options and helps people to help start discussions regarding their wishes with family, healthcare providers, and anyone who they care about and who cares about them. CNC goes out into communities where people are curious about end of life options, no matter what demographic they belong to, and to unite everyone to change how we think about death and to expand the options available to us all. They work to achieve government policies that allow people to control their own healthcare decisions. And they do that with the help of volunteers like us at CNC Iowa. CNC Iowa is a statewide group that works with the Iowa legislature to pass laws for individual freedom and end of life choices. We educate the public on options available to them through group presentations, tabling at conferences and other gatherings, and online presentations like this one. I'll say more on how you can become informed and involved at the end of this program. And now I will turn the mic over to another of CNC Iowa's volunteers, Marion Schwabauer.
Thank you, Sue. As Sue said, I'm a volunteer also with Choices and Compassion Iowa. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our program. We have 3 speakers today. After each of the 3 presentations are finished, after they are all finished, there will be an open question and answer session. So if you have questions during a speaker presentation, please hold it until the question and answer session at the end, or write the question in the chat. Sue will be monitoring the chat for any questions. So our first speaker is Ken Holmes. Ken worked in nuclear cardiology as a physician assistant and then obtained a master's in education and became the University of Iowa Nuclear Medicine Technology Education Program Director. That's when I first knew Ken. He then worked as a certified pre-planning consultant with Lansing Funeral Home in Iowa City for the past 31 years. He helps people plan funerals by listening and trying to understand their wishes and their family's needs, explaining options, researching, and facilitating the arrangements that they choose. Ken has met with more than 10,000 people to pre-plan their own or a family member's or a client's pre-arrangements. When we asked Ken to speak today, he immediately agreed because he saw it as an opportunity to expand his own knowledge of alternative body dispositions and then could share it with others. So with that, I will now turn the microphone over to Ken Holmes. Ken?
And you're muted.
I was
There you
muted.
go.
Sorry. Thank you for that great introduction. I'll pay you later. I want to say thank you for inviting me to speak to your group. I have a great respect for what your group does. And in what I do, I share a belief in things that you talked about on the Zoom, the last Zoom I was on with your group, about end of life autonomy and end of life options, and I deal in that world too, and empowering people with knowledge that helps them to make their own decisions and make better decisions for themselves and their families and survivors. So yeah, we have an overlap there. And now it kind of makes sense why I was invited to talk to your group, because it seemed like we were on different sides of death. But in actuality, I work with the living to figure out what they want to do on the other side. So, but I appreciate that. So first, I want to just say funeral professionals in a general sense help families with memorialization and also disposition of the deceased. What we're talking about today is focused more on that side of it, the disposition of the body. In the US last year, more than 3 million people died. 90% of them were casket buried in a conventional cemetery or cremated. More specifically, 38% were casket buried and about 62% were cremated. Just for comparison purposes, Japan has almost 100% cremation. And on the other end, the extreme, Greece has about 3.4% cremation. So there is a lot of variation worldwide on that. Some realities of the current tradition. I'm using the wrong mouse again. I bet nobody's ever done that. Two computers going and you're using the wrong mouse. So some of the current realities of traditional practices, conventional burial consumes land, it can pollute soil, contributes to climate change through especially the resource intensive manufacture and transportation of caskets, vaults, and grave liners and headstones. Cremation burns fossil fuels and emits carbon dioxide as much as a 600-mile car trip for each body. And as particulates are also released into the atmosphere, including things like mercury. Contrary to popular belief, the environmental impact of cremation is about the same as conventional burial, which is interesting because I have a lot of people who say they choose cremation because it's more eco-friendly. Sorry to inform you of that. Many alternatives have been suggested to address these concerns, and I will explore some of them. But I thought it would be good to just mention a few of the variations on the traditional burial and cremation, and then we'll talk about the alternatives, because there are a lot of variations within the traditionals. One of those is mausoleum entombment, above ground structures for either an individual or a family, or it could be for a community. The cost varies quite a bit depending on the size, the materials, and the location. So they can be from thousands to $1 million. And of course, there's a carbon footprint with that construction and the materials. Another variation is sky burial, not something that you see much in person, but in movies you see it. A body is placed on a mountaintop, in a tree, or on an elevated platform to be consumed by animals or decomposed by the elements. It has been done for many years and is still done by some Tibetan Buddhists, and used to be by some Native American tribes as well. This is not legal in the US, with an exception that I'll mention later. Another variation is burial at sea, also known as water burial. A body is placed in a biodegradable casket, and that could be wood or it could be steel. It wouldn't be something like copper. It has to be something that would eventually be degraded. It has to have a lot of holes in it and extra weight to be sure it stays at the bottom. It has to be 3 nautical miles from shore and at least 600 feet deep. But in some places, it might be required to be as much as 1,800 feet deep. Also, the Environmental Protection Agency has to be notified. The cost can vary from $500 to $10,000. The Navy will provide this service for free for veterans of any branch of service and their dependents. So it's not just for Navy, it's for any branch of service. And then there's another variation with burial, and that's home burial, also known as burial on private property. That one I'm not going to talk about because we have two experts talking later who are working in that realm. So I'll pass over that one. And I also want to share a few variations on traditional cremation. One that's popular in other places in the world is open air cremation, also known as funeral pyre. Those are commonly done in India, Nepal, and Southeast Asia. In the US, it's legal only in one state, Colorado. The thing about it that's significant is that it requires 1,000 to 2,000 pounds of wood. And depending on the type of wood, and of course, there's emissions, carbon dioxide and particulates. And unlike a crematory, they're not processed in any way to reduce them. The cost can be from $500 to $800. Most people are aware that cremated remains can be buried in the ground. They can be placed in a columbarium niche above ground, which is like a mausoleum crypt, but smaller. They can be kept at home or they can be scattered. And I just want to mention scattering options because there are many of those. I can't even cover all of them, but commonly they're scattered in wooded areas, gardens, lakes, or rivers, but not behind home bench at Kinnick Stadium. That's the #1 place that people request that is not possible to do, of course. So a lot of what I do is educating people on what they can't do so they can come up with a better idea. The important thing about scattering in these common areas is to be discreet about it and use common sense. Another option is to scatter with a tree planted above the cremated remains. A lot of people don't realize cremated remains are inert. They have no nutritive value to a tree. And if you're going to do that, you need to mix some soil in with it or the tree's not going to do very well. And the other thing is to choose a tree that's appropriate for the zone that you're planting it in. And maybe an appropriate one for the area. There's also scattering at sea or on the sea. If you're going to do that, you have to go 3 nautical miles out. And there is a difference between nautical miles and regular miles. I learned that in the process of doing this. Nautical miles are just a little bit longer. Companies such as the Neptune Society can assist with that. Their cost can be $100 if it's unattended, if they just take the remains and do it. But if you want to have people there, and depending on the location, the number of passengers, and it can be up to $10,000. I did learn a few people that chose to have their cremated remains scattered at sea. Alfred Hitchcock, Janis Joplin, and Robin Williams, just to name a few. They can be scattered from a plane. You have to have reasonable precautions because you're not supposed to drop things on people from planes. So you don't want to drop the urn. And it has to be done in a certain way so that they don't come back in the plane when you try and dump them. So you need professional pilot services that can assist with that, and they range from 200 to 2,000. Also, they can be scattered in space. This one's near and dear to my heart. I'm a big Star Trek, Star Wars fan. So typically 3 grams of cremated remains, which is a very small amount, or they're now doing bits of DNA, tiny bit of DNA from a cheek swab, can be taken to space and back for $2,500. They can be placed in orbit for $5,000, and then they will gradually descend and burn up in the atmosphere. They can be placed on the moon for $13,000, or for the same amount, they can be sent to deep space in a probe. And this has been done by NASA and also private companies such as Celestis. For those who are madly trying to take notes on this, I'm going to have the transcript of this available to be sent to you if you want it, and I'll give you my email address at the end, because I'm sure there's some people swearing right now because they can't write that fast. So I just want you to enjoy. The next flight that Celestis is doing is scheduled for April 2025. So you know what you got to do if you want to go on that one. I'll just mention a few people: Gene Roddenberry and James Doohan, both connected to Star Trek. James was Scotty. They were placed in orbit. Gene Shoemaker is on the moon. He was famous for identifying the comet Shoemaker-Levy 9 that crashed into Jupiter. Clyde Tombaugh, who discovered Pluto, is on the New Horizons probe that went by Pluto in 2015. So I geeked out on all that. Cremated remains can also be incorporated in stones, diamonds, fireworks, coral reefs, teddy bears, bullets, vinyl records, tattoos, jewelry, or art pieces, paint and sculpture, for example. So those are some of the variations on the traditional burial and cremation. Now we can get into what you probably wanted to hear more about, is the alternatives to those traditional. Green burial is the one that I get asked about the most. And I'll provide you some information about that, and you'll hear from other speakers a little more about that, more related to the cemetery side of things. Green burial is also known as green funeral, natural burial, eco-friendly burial. In a way, it's what's old is new again, because it's a return to burial traditions of the past. On the Oregon Trail, somebody dies, you dig a hole, you put them in it, you cover them up, maybe a wood cross that'll blow away eventually, and you leave. That's the real green burial in the old days. But nowadays, more specifically, it's burial of unembalmed remains directly in the ground using a biodegradable container and without a vault, so as not to inhibit natural decomposition. The family might even dig the grave by hand. The grave could be marked with plantings, wildflowers, or native plants, or a rock, or a tree, or nothing. In some green cemeteries, they locate by GPS coordinates, and the family has those. Green burial is about having less impact on the environment, conserving natural resources, reducing carbon emissions, and even preserving or restoring natural habitat. Kermit the Frog sang, "It's not easy being green." And sometimes the green thing you want to do conflicts with the cemetery rules or the needs of family or the type of services that you want. So I think of it in terms of there are many shades of green, or ways to make your funeral as green as possible. And I work a lot with people to do that. It could include alternatives to formaldehyde balming, including timely burial, refrigeration, dry ice, non-toxic embalming fluids. There's a company, Enigma, that specializes in that, or essential oils. Biodegradable clothing made of natural fibers, or a shroud, or a mushroom suit that's laced with mushrooms that help the decomposition process. For those who want to know, Luke Perry, Beverly Hills 90210, was buried in a mushroom suit. Many cemeteries require outer burial containers, concrete, plastic, or metal, to support the earth and prevent dips in the land and tipping of markers. But some cemeteries will allow burial without those. And of course, you'll learn more about these cemeteries later. Biodegradable caskets and containers, such as bamboo, willow, or seagrass, and in addition to woods, which would decompose over time. Memorial contributions could be to environmental causes, or people could be asked to plant native trees, shrubs, or flowers in memory of a person. So there are many ways to make a funeral greener. Some religions and cultures, Islamic and Jewish in particular, have continued to practice versions of natural burial for centuries. And so that's green burial. The next alternative I'm going to talk about is human composting, also known as natural organic reduction, body composting, terramation, soil transformation, or recomposting. This is a natural process that transforms a body into compost, mulch, or soil. It's like natural decomposition and what farmers have done with livestock for years. Some providers offer family participation in what they call a laying in ceremony, where the body is placed in a container in an organic shroud, and then added to that are natural materials such as straw, alfalfa, sawdust, wood chips, and flowers. Moisture and oxygen and the natural microbes in a body do the rest over 5 to 12 weeks, depending on the method. And after that, metal is removed. So like my new artificial hip would be taken out at that point. Bone is left because that takes longer to decompose. And some places will reduce that partially for further composting, or completely reduce it in what's called a cremulator. It's like a giant industrial blender. But cremulator sounds so much better. And then it's mixed back in. So the end result is the soil, compost, mulch, and it's returned to the family, either all of it or a portion of it. And the balance of it can be donated to conservation projects. So the places that actually do this generally will have their places where they will use it for conservation. This reduces the environmental costs. The energy source is typically electricity. Often these companies that do this are totally renewable energy. It only takes about 40 gallons of water, compared to aquamation, which we're going to talk about in a few minutes, which requires a lot more water, 10 times more water. With this process, there's no CO2 emissions compared to cremation, which produces, like I said, emissions and up to 600 pounds of CO2. Each person who's composted produces about 1 cubic yard, which would be 1 to 200 pounds of compost, mulch, or soil. It costs about a range $5,000 to $7,000 for the procedure, but you also have body transportation and soil, mulch, shipping costs as well. Human composting is legal in 12 states. Washington was the first in 2019. And then many other states, and at least 13 other states have introduced legislation, including Iowa, but it failed to pass last year. That's the information that I have. Our specialists in that field might know otherwise. I do want to mention that Hawaii has such a strong funeral director lobby there they managed to get a law passed that you can't do human composting until July 1st of 2050. So interesting. The providers that do this, it's generally associated with funeral homes, and funeral professionals are doing it. There are 3 big companies that do this in Washington, where it started: Recompose, Earth Funeral, and Return Home. Recompose was the first one that started it. Katrina Spade was the person who came up with the idea and commercialized it. And you can go online and actually do tours of their facilities. They exclude people who have radiation-related deaths and radioactive implants, and those with certain infections, Ebola, active tuberculosis, prion diseases like Creutzfeldt-Jakob. The Catholic Church in Washington State has indicated that composting is fine for eggshells and food scraps, but not so much for human bodies. Another version of this would be what's called tree pod, also known as tree burial. Capsula Mundi is a company in Italy that's Latin for world's capsule. They came up with this idea, and they have beautiful pictures of it in their advertisement. A body is placed in fetal position, not easy to do, in an egg-shaped pod made of a biodegradable starch-based plastic. The pod is then buried with a tree planted above it. Currently, this is not available in the US. It's not available anywhere, including Italy, where the idea sprouted. So it's a beautiful idea, but not as practical as they originally thought. The next alternative is water cremation. And this one wins the award for most different names. It's also known as alkaline hydrolysis, aquamation, wet cremation, resomation, biocremation, liquid cremation, green cremation, flameless cremation, water reduction, or tissue digestion. You notice a lot of references to cremation, even though it's not. And the reason that they did that was because there are many medical schools that and state regulations for them that specify that deeded bodies will be cremated after they're finished. So they needed to come up with a name that had cremation in it so they could still do that. So just interesting fact. The body is placed in a special container filled with up to 400 gallons of water with some alkaline material, like potassium hydride, which is lye. And it's heated under pressure, and in some cases agitated for 3 to 16 hours, depending on the temperature and pressure. So because of the pressure, even though it's high temperature, it doesn't actually boil. The lye releases hydrogen ions from the water molecules, which then break apart the chemical bonds in the proteins and fats that make up a body. This also happens to destroy pathogens. So all that's left is a brownish green sterile fluid and bones. The fluid goes down the drain. And as we learned from Finding Nemo, all drains lead to the ocean, if that makes you feel better. The bones, it turns out about 30% more than the amount of bones at the end of a cremation. Those are dried, they're reduced, again, using that like a cremulator, and then they're placed in a container, which we would call an urn, just like we do with cremation. Compared to cremation, though, this is more environmentally friendly, quieter, gentler, and uses 10 to 25% of the energy of cremation. The cost is $2,000 to $5,000. Water cremation is legal in all 50 states for animals. So that would include pets. And it's been used a similar fashion since 1888 to make fertilizer from livestock. Florida was the first state to legalize it for human cadavers in 1990, and then Minnesota, Illinois, Missouri, and now 25 other states since then. 15 states have active practitioners that are doing it with humans. Many of those are at medical school deeded body programs. Iowa has not legalized this at this point. Most Islamic and Jewish cultures see cremation in any form as desecration of the body. Some Catholics have said aquamation does not show adequate respect for the human body, nor express hope in the resurrection. I just pass that along. When I'm working with people, there's what churches and religions say, and then there's what people do. So that's a personal choice. Wrong mouse. Another alternative is body donation, also known as body deeding, anatomical donation, donating your body to science. Medical schools accept bodies for scientific research and student dissection. Individuals submit an application in advance for approval. And this cuts down on grave robbing. That's one of the reasons they do that. Individuals, after the studies are completed, typically they're cremated, placed in an urn, and those can be either buried in a communal grave, or they can be returned to family to do otherwise, if they want to bury them somewhere or scatter them or do any of the other alternatives we've talked about. Embalming must be done soon after death, typically within 8 hours. It's the first thing that they would do when they receive a body is embalm. So it can be done by a funeral home if service are desired before deeding. So if you want to have traditional visitation service, funeral home would do the embalming, and then you can be taken over to the deeded body program. A lot of people don't realize that. Some programs may not accept some people due to certain contagious infections, traumatic deaths, if they've had an autopsy, if they've donated major organs, if they didn't get embalmed within 8 hours, or also based on height and weight combination. These exclusions happen about 5% of the time. So if you're planning to deed your body, you want to have an alternative plan. A variation on body donation is body farms. And when I talked about that that the sky burial, this is a variation of that I mentioned earlier. Also known as forensic anthropology facilities or decomposition research facilities. And a lot of people just call it the farm. Advancing the science of criminal forensics is what they do. There are 8 in the United States. They are also in Australia and Canada. The first one in the US was at the University of Tennessee in Knoxville in 1981. There are others. The others are at universities in North Carolina, Texas, Illinois, Colorado, Michigan, Florida, and Virginia. Voluntarily donated bodies are left in various environmental situations and studied. So they might be in a tree, they might be in the trunk of a car, they might be in a creek. The point is that they can then study them and learn from them. So for you people who are really dedicated to CSI, currently there are 500 pre-donors. People are excluded for certain contagious diseases or active infections. And you can still donate organs, and also for living transplant, and then donate your body to the farm. They'll accept that. Another variation on donating is called plastination. This is preserving body parts or complete bodies for teaching. Bodies or organs are drained of fluid and infused with and encased in a plastic-like substance. That way they never degrade or decompose. If you've heard anything or seen anything about the Body Worlds exhibits, those are using plastinated specimens. This started in Germany, so it's easier to get done there. It's less widely available, but it's another option. Another that is not very widely done, Cremation, also known as freeze drying. And this is because our body is 70% water. So theoretically, if you freeze it and then shatter it, it would be in a lot of little pieces. So that's the basis for it. So a person's placed in liquid nitrogen and then vibrated mechanically or with ultrasound, resulting in small pieces that are dried. And then this, and they dry it, so it stops the decomposition temporarily until it's taken to be buried in a grave shallow enough that oxygen can aid in the decomposition, which will then pick up with the moisture. And this is legal in Sweden, United Kingdom, and South Korea, but nobody has a facility to do it currently. So it's just an idea at this point. Another one that is not in the mainstream, mummification. Yes, some people are still doing that. Preservation of a body by removing moisture. The original process took 70 days. There's a modern religion group called Summum, S-U-M-M-U-M, founded in 1975 in Salt Lake City. They practice mummification. It takes 1,000 hours. The cost is $67,000. But if you just want to do a pet, they can do that for $4,000 to $30,000, depending on the size of the pet. Another one you don't hear about a lot is cryogenic preservation, also known as biostasis or life extension. A body or just a head is stored in liquid nitrogen, minus 320 degrees, with the hope of being reanimated in the future. This has been available since 1967. The cost is $28,000 for a head to whole body for $200,000. About 500 people are currently in cryosleep. Most people have heard, if they've heard of this, they know about Ted Williams, the baseball player. But a lot of people think Walt Disney was cryogenically frozen, but he wasn't. His family has been very adamant about making sure people know that. So not Walt Disney. All right. So that's the tour. In summary, the options we have looked at will continue to evolve. Some will become more widely available. Others will become interesting footnotes in history. New ideas, most assuredly, will come along. It's important, if you're interested in these things, to do your own research and talk with your family, make your wishes known. The more unorthodox your choice, the more important it is to plan for it. It is also a good idea to write it down and sign it with witnesses or notarization, because there might be some confusion or conflict involved. And keep in mind, because of variations in manufacturers and state and local laws, there may be differences in process and requirements in different places. Your funeral professional can help explain what is available in your area. All right.
Okay.
And there'll
Ken,
be
you want
questions
to-
later. Yeah, oh, you want my
Yes.
email
Yes,
address?
your,
I'll give that
your
right now.
email address.
It's KB Holmes, Holmes, 52, the number 52, at gmail.com. So you can request it, and I can send you a transcript, which I just dropped on the floor. And I will send you one. And also, if you have questions that don't get answered through the Zoom.
Could you
Thank you.
put your
Okay.
email in the chat, please?
Put my what?
Your email in the chat?
In the chat. Certainly, I can do that.
Okay.
All right.
Yes.
You're
Thank
welcome.
you, Ken. So our next speaker is Becky Hoffbauer, who will talk about national burials. natural burials. While Becky's education is in studio arts, she considers her callings to be a Reiki practitioner, a death midwife, and a cemetery builder. Her love of the earth and its countless forms of life are a very natural fit with her death work. She's been interested in natural burials for more than a decade. She's a member of the Conservation Burial Alliance and the Back to Ground Natural Burial Cemetery Group. With her studio arts education, Becky is also interested in designing and making death wares, creating an arts collective here in Iowa to make nature-based biodegradable wares such as coffins, urns, shrouds, etc. With several death doulas on their board, they are planning to eventually provide services to train and guide families and friends to hold their own home funerals and to be more directly involved in the care of their dead. So, Becky, we look forward to hearing more about your work.
Thank you, Marion, and thank you, Ken, for your thorough coverage of natural burial. I'll try to fill in some of the details a little bit. As Marion said, I'm here with my colleague Pete Brokaw from Back to Ground Natural Burial Cemetery. Here in Iowa City, this is a nonprofit organization that at the very basic beginning was a couple of years ago. So we don't currently have land. We're not a functional cemetery yet at this time. It takes quite a bit of time to put together all the components to create a natural cemetery or a conservation burial cemetery. According to our friends and colleagues in the Conservation Burial Alliance, typically 5 years is not unreasonable. I'm hoping that I make it in time so I don't have to use my prepaid cremation that I bought over a decade ago. And I hope to be able to donate that to somebody who needs it and wants it, because I would much rather be buried in the earth, directly in the soil, in the natural burial way. As Ken mentioned, natural burial is essentially the way people have been burying, for the most part, burying our dead for millennia, since before the American Civil War, which changed things fairly drastically. When there were such massive numbers of corpses and people were so far away from home that embalming became an industry in order to be able to transport tens of thousands of bodies home on trains for a short period of preservation. Embalming's typically maybe around 5 days of decent, without refrigeration anyway, actual preservation. It's temporary. So part of this movement, it's been going on for over 20 years. South Carolina's Ramsey Creek Conservation Burial Cemetery is among the first in the nation to make a choice to return to this practice. And I guess I should define the difference between well, there are several different kinds of cemeteries. There's a hybrid cemetery situation, which Ken touched on, which is a conventional cemetery that has had a small portion set aside for natural burial to kind of capitalize on this burgeoning practice. And they do have varying options. Here in Iowa City, we have Oakland Cemetery, and they do have a couple of natural burial sections you can't be buried in a shroud directly in that cemetery. That's just a cemetery convenience choice. Most cemeteries, as we will, make their own policies. I'm sorry for the movement here. My cat needs me to open a door for him. So Iowa does not have any dedicated natural burial cemetery at this time. So we hope to be the first to do that. What makes a conservation burial cemetery is a natural cemetery that has a partnership of some kind with a preservation, a land management preservation organization, a land trust. We have been in conversation with Baroque Land Trust for the last couple of years. We don't have anything solidified with them, but they're quite interested in that operation partnership, and that would be creating a legal and binding contract for them to protect the land and possibly restore it as well, depending on what land we find in perpetuity. So we have been talking about what size of cemetery that would be optimal. And one of the things that we have to think about in terms of choosing that is what is on the land that we buy. We're going to need some kind of infrastructure because there's going to have to be some roads. But essentially, a conservation burial cemetery is a nature preserve. So you might walk through this nature preserve on paths such as you would in Hickory Hill Park. And you might not even know that you're in a cemetery if you did not deliberately make the choice to go there. So this is a way to visualize what the differences are between conventional burial, where you walk across a flat lawn that is closely cropped and there is not a weed in sight, and there are vertical tombstones standing up all over. A conservation natural burial cemetery might be prairie or meadowlands. It might be woodlands. It might have water features where there could be burials in that area. There are laws about how far between the water feature and the burials can actually happen. I have visited 4 or 5 cemeteries in the US, 2 in North Carolina, 1 in Wisconsin, 1 in Illinois. And in all cases, there are large parcels of land that are under preserve protection. And as Ken pointed out also, so what is a natural burial? So a grave in a natural burial would be approximately 3.5 to 4 feet deep, much shallower than in a conventional cemetery, because there's not going to be any vault or grave liner of any kind. The body is typically just in a shroud of biodegradable fabric material. We are going to allow containers, as many of these cemeteries do. Some of them allow both, but then the typical trend is that people see or attend a shroud burial, and that's the preference. I was out at Naturopath Sanctuary in Verona, Wisconsin a few weeks ago, and they allow container burials, but 70% of their burials are shroud burials. So a shroud would have to be a biodegradable material like cotton or linen or bamboo. And if people do choose a container, as Ken pointed out, cardboard, soft woods with no metal parts. It would be made with dowels or dovetailing, no hardwoods, no varnishes, no plastic of any kind. The body cannot be embalmed to be buried in a natural cemetery. Let's see. So one of the trends that seems to be happening with some of the cemeteries is, as Marion mentioned, we have 3 death midwives, including myself, on our board. And we would like to be able to create a resource for families to have a lot more involvement in a funeral of their loved one or their friend. It is legal in every state to have some level of involvement. Iowa is kind of middling in terms of how much is allowed. Pretty much a family can have keep their person at home. They can do the body washing. They can they can shroud them, put them in a container, and death doulas can assist in guiding families in this, because it's a much more meaningful and deeper connection to the burial itself and the loss of a loved one, to have hands-on experience with the death process for families, as people typically report. So a natural cemetery is a cemetery that is going to have all of these features. The conservation burial movement is growing so quickly that I couldn't even tell you now what the numbers are in the US. At the time that we got involved, it was somewhere around 13 that were certified conservation burial cemeteries. Now it's somewhere between 20 and 30. And then if you count natural cemeteries that don't take that extra step and want to call themselves conservation cemeteries, then it's somewhere over 200 at least. So one of the reasons that people might choose a natural burial over a conventional burial is because of their own personal living philosophy about how they interact with the planet that sustains us. The body in the earth begins to break down fairly quickly in that shallower grave, partly because you're at a level that's much more oxygenated than a deeper hole. And if you're not in a container, then you are readily accessible by the soil microbes and living fauna that live in the soil that interact with your own gut biome to biodegrade the body, and then return you to a substance that's usable by plants, taproots of trees, and other beings that live in the soil as a source of food and nutrition. So I have a quote here from Neil deGrasse Tyson that kind of illustrates this idea. He is an American astrophysicist, as some of you may know, and he's talking about his own personal choice is for burial, because if you're buried, the energy content of your body long developed by the flora and fauna that you've eaten your whole entire life. If you're buried, that energy content gets returned to the earth. And I don't mean that just in a poetic way. Worms will eat you, plants, taproots, and your and you feed flora and fauna the way you've dined upon flora and fauna your whole life. For me, that is the cycle of life. I have some very good resources that can videos and books and other information on natural burial, conservation burial, things to consider when, if you're thinking about this option. If you would like to get on our mailing list, I can send you an email loaded with those resources. If you send us an email to back to ground natural burial at gmail.com, that is our cemetery account. We'll put you on the mailing list, and you'll get 1 to 2 newsletters a year, probably more once we start getting more active in terms of fundraising and etc.
Could you repeat your email, please?
Yes, I can probably put it in the chat here too.
That
if
would
that's
be great.
easier. Okay. I have to check it here.
God, I'm dying here. Really?
Are you putting it in the chat, Becky?
I believe so.
Okay, good.
Something keeps popping up though and getting in the way. I'm not sure what that is. Let me make sure I got it right. Back to ground natural burial.
Right.
Okay.
Or we can move on to Pete and then you can put it in.
It's in there now. Yes, we can
Okay,
we can move on to Pete.
okay. So when Pete got up this morning, he didn't know he was going to be here. And so he's filling in on very short notice for Jeffery Ford, who was the person who was intended to be here. Pete worked at the University of Iowa in the central IT department before he retired. He's been a long-term member of the Unitarian Universalist Society. His first introduction to natural burial came at a presentation at the Society several years ago. That presentation sparked his and many other people's interest. And so Pete joined Back to Ground about 18 months ago and is currently a board member. So Pete, will be happy to hear what you have to say about conservation burials and Back to Ground Cemetery. And then we will take questions after Pete is finished.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Marion. And thanks again to Ken and to Becky. I do want to say I've learned so much from Becky. Her depth of knowledge in natural burial, conservation burial is amazing, and I've learned so much just in the time that we've known each other. So I'll just kind of give a brief background on me. So for a very long time, I've known that I didn't want a traditional burial with a marker and the embalming and that. And I assumed that cremation was my only option, but then, my family had to fight over my ashes and I didn't want to start all that up. So I was amazed when I heard this presentation at the Unitarian Universalists about natural burial, which at the time was available out of state. And that just kind of began the journey. That was several years ago, and I just happened to catch Jeffery and Becky, who were kind of in the beginning stages of their association. And so that got my that was my connection to the group. So when so the more time we spent together, the more options I found out were available, and that's, I think, maybe the most important part of all of this, is that there's a conversation to be had both internally with yourself and with your family. As Ken said, you want to make sure that your whatever you decide is well known and documented. After people die, especially if it's sudden, there's a lot of things that happen in that first week, and your wishes, if they're not known, you may not have your wishes taken forward the way you thought. So I think that's an important piece to this. Not everyone will agree. Some people will always want a quote unquote traditional burial, meaning a modern traditional burial with embalming in a vault and a headstone. But I think just in the short time that we've been meeting with people, I think the interest is, we're just at the beginning stages of it locally. And as people learn more about it, it makes so much more sense to me, and I think to a lot of people. It's just nice to know that you have some options. And for me, I'd actually like to take it one step further. I don't need my plot of land forever. I'd be happy to share my spot once decomposition for me has taken place. Why not let somebody else use that space? That seems to be, for me, that makes sense. But I know that is currently not possible. But who knows, with the number of people that have lived on this land over thousands of years, that you're not going to be taking up somebody else's space. But that's down the road in many ways. So I do want to just give you a little bit of history on the Back to Ground organization. We are, I think Becky and maybe Jeffrey, Becky especially, has been at just at the very beginning, maybe 6 years ago, looking at the options, what's available in Iowa, what does it take to offer something in Iowa. And she's traveled, as she said, to 4 other sites, and it's really interesting to hear how their stories are different from ours. So much of it is specific to the land that they have in their control, and how that makes each one unique. And if you look at the websites that these places have, and those are things that Becky, if you write to Becky, and I can give you another resource there, they have their websites, they have YouTube videos. I mean, there's all kinds of things that I think are really, really interesting. Some really interesting books, if you're interested in that process as well. So the work here in the current group has been going on for about 3 years, so not as long, but that's the kind of the current iteration of where we are right now, and it is a process. I mean, there's a lot to getting a group established and being recognized as a not-for-profit, and getting all the forms and the paperwork filled out, just to get to the point where we can really have that discussion. Trying to find land is a very interesting process. We had an offer made, or some interest made, within the last several months, but it was so close to the interstate that it would be just so not possible. Nobody would want to be out there as a nature preserve, and so that really, those are the kinds of things you have to be aware of. we have also land conservation. The Borough Land Trust is a really nice organization. They do a lot of good work, and they are committed to the conservation of property of the land so that it is maintained as a natural site. And so when you look at things like, I would like to plant a tree next to the person that's been buried, or I want to put in wildflowers or things. Well, if they aren't native to that, to wherever the burial is happening, that really doesn't work with the idea of conservation. That you really need to work closely with the people who are maintaining the land as to what is possible. And those are some of the policy kind of things that we will have to work on as we're moving forward, so that those questions can be asked and answered beforehand.
Okay.
So we are currently a board of 8 people, and we're looking to get up to between 9 and 11 is kind of our ideal number, and having people with various skill sets. And so we are still growing, and we're still looking at people that have expressed interest. Beyond the board, we're also looking just for volunteers, people that want to work in the various places that we're expanding. The kinds of things we're looking at are marketing and fundraising, land acquisition, establishing policies. We have a small group already looking at building a website that we can publish more of the information that we have. So we're still in the process of establishing our nonprofit status. We can't really do any fundraising until that's formalized, and fundraising is a big piece of what we need to do to get established. Before we can get approval to bury somebody, we need to have an endowment in place and verified, and that endowment needs to be bigger than that initial amount. We need to keep growing. We'll have operating funds. We need to look at acquiring land and volunteers. This takes a lot of work for people, and it's work that we love to do. But again, it's important. So if you are interested in learning more about our organization, that email address that Becky gave in the chat is a great way to do that. If you let us know what your interests are, we'd be happy to get back in touch with you and hopefully start a conversation about that. We are not in a position yet to take any money or any interest in actual burials yet. We have more of the groundwork to do yet, but we're making progress, and I think that's really exciting here. And if you Becky sends out a newsletter every so often, not too much information. It's not going to be a spam problem, but as things change for us, we'll be sending out information on the newsletter to people who are on the mailing list. So thank you for inviting us here, and I think there's still some time for questions if people have them.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, thank you, Pete, for stepping up to the plate. And we do have some questions in the chat, but perhaps we should take questions from the group first. So if you have a question, please state your name and the person that you would like to address the question to. Denise, I see your hand.
Mm-hmm.
Denise?
Yes, I do. Yes. And this is for Ken or Becky. And I'm curious to know what the cost might be for natural burial in whether it's a conservation cemetery or a natural cemetery.
I can address that in a general sort of sense.
Yeah.
It is contingent upon a variety of factors. And some of that is the kind of land that is found, and then the level of difficulty of the actual physical burial part. The economic market for what part of the country is going to be a factor. I can tell you that the naturopath cemetery that I was at in Verona, Wisconsin a few weeks ago, they have two nonprofit organizations. One is the cemetery, and one is this almost 200-acre Farley Center for Peace and Social Justice. The cemetery takes up 20 acres and funds entirely and above everything that happens in this other nonprofit. And the way they have it set up is that if you want to pay for a right to burial in the cemetery, you pay a minimum of $3,000 endowment to that social peace and justice organization. And then the burial itself, for a full body burial without a casket, is $1,500. That's opening the grave, moving the body, taking the body and lowering it down, and closing the grave. Pretty much covers everything, which is a very reasonable price. An additional $200 if you want a casket, and additional $300 if you insist the burial happen on a Saturday or Sunday, because they like their time off just like we do. So that's an example.
Okay. Another question? Well, the question.
I'm unmuted. I'm sorry. I unmuted myself because my hand was raised and I didn't think that you
Oh, okay.
Hi, my name is Ruth Ellen Mulberg. I'm here in Florida. Thanks for letting us talk, because I could do it faster than type. I came to one of Compassion and Choices webinars where this was part of it, like 4 or 5 years ago, or maybe 4 years ago. And I'm trying to see how it's advanced. So Ken gave me some help. Now, I'm a 70-year-old woman. I'm trying to plan for the future, and I'd rather do it in an economic way and a climate-friendly way. And so I was looking at cremation, even though as a Jew, technically, that was a no-no, but I'm not that Orthodox. But then I found out how much carbon footprint it has. So some of these other options that Ken mentioned are developing. Does anybody have any notion on the individual level, like if you're trying to plan for your last wishes? I'd like to do that, but it seems like the state of the art of the availability and local laws and everything is not caught up with it. Does anyone have any suggestions how to do that? Like put a contingency in, or like if I die tomorrow, cremate me. If not, this is what I prefer, or anything. If anybody can say anything to that, thank you.
Yes, all the above. Yeah. You can only plan so much, and it's the best way to think about it is if something had happened last week, what would probably been done, and that's your starting point, and it may not work out, or you may live to see new ideas come along that you prefer, and you can always change what you have written down, but you can't just wait for the ideal thing to come along, because you might not make it that long. So plan now, have a plan, and then you can modify it if you need to in the future.
Can I add one thing to that? Because you meant part of it is trying to be economical and planning ahead, like you mentioned Neptune Society, which my husband used. Are any of these burial societies and funeral homes, are they coming on board with this stuff? Because I would think they'd be resistant to change because it's going to affect their bottom line. Or are they responding to the markets?
Well, I can say that cremation was that way when it first came out. I mean, it took a while for funeral homes to feel comfortable enough to put in a crematory, because it was a major investment, and they wanted to kind of make sure that it was going to actually happen. And we were using an out-of-town crematory. They were doing it for a large area of people, and then slowly people started adding their own crematories as they saw that it was financially feasible. And I mean, it is a business. You have to be able to pay for all that equipment that you put in, and so that it'll happen with other things as it's appreciated that there's enough business to justify the investment in it and enough to keep it going. And so I've talked to Michael Lensing, who's the owner of the funeral home I'm at, and I said, what do you think? Do you think we could do aquamation? Would you be willing to invest in that? And no way, not right now. And that's the way a lot of these things are. It's going to take time for people to see the value of investing in those. So, but over time, I can say these are really good ideas. And yeah, the green burial idea is a great idea. And I think eventually there will be. I have faith in these great people here who are working on it, that there will be a green cemetery close. So
In the meantime, Florida has two very excellent conservation burial cemeteries. Prairie Creek is one. I can't think of the name of the other one, and there may be more than that. I'm not sure.
I think the other kind of important part of this is making sure that people know what your wishes are. You can't put it in your will because that will happen too late. So it needs to be part of whatever your medical desires are, or that you've spoken to your family and that they know what it is you want to have done.
Right, I'm aware of that. Thank you so much. Great answers. Thank you, guys.
Craig?
So, Becky, I wonder if you could say a little bit more about sort of the next steps, the search for land, what you see needing to happen in the next 6 months to kind of move this forward. I understand you're talking to Burr Oak. That sounds like a great opportunity. But I'd be interested to know a little more about sort of what's happening and what needs to happen soon.
Well, wow, that's a big question. There's always moving parts that are kind of going on all the time. So at our monthly meetings, those who are working on the excuse me, on the website, come in and report where that's advancing and progressing. Pete's part of that piece. I'm kind of the hub of educational outreach and networking, and it's not necessarily a choice that I made. It just seems to kind of happen because I'm a death worker, and so I'm around a lot of people who are dealing with death. And so it just kind of like opportunities come up. But so the land piece is definitely a priority. We can start looking before we have the money to spend. It would be great if somebody appeared on our doorstep with 200 acres and they wanted to donate it. Just saying. We do have a little seed of a possibility that kind of came up organically. So we'll be having a conversation with the Amana Society because they have some undeveloped land and they're willing to talk to us. That's all we know. It doesn't mean that we've got a deal going forward. They are very much a for-profit organization and we're very much a nonprofit organization, but some of the folks out there in the Conservation Burial Alliance group have given us positive feedback that's an arrangement that can be made. A lot of these cemeteries have very different setups. For the economic factor, some of them, one of them was a family ranch inherited. Prairie Creek that I mentioned down in Florida is also partly privately owned, but it was also originally a 200 acre nature preserve before the cemetery came on board, which is also what happened with Casper Creek Cemetery in Galena, Illinois. Is they were a nature preserve and they were looking for ways to support the land trust that was protecting that preserve. So it just depends on a lot of factors for that. Other pieces that are coming forward, Pete, feel free to jump in. I'm feeling a little scattered. If I'm missing anything major in terms of like what's our next move. We are all very eager to jump on fundraising. We're all very eager to jump on more educational outreach opportunities, which I was just at the senior center yesterday, as you probably know, Craig, with our queer elders group, doing a talk there. So there will be a lot more in the future. You know, our some of our board members are kind of brand new and you know, are not quite ready to be in the forefront, because they're, you know, trying kind of hitting the ground running and trying to get up to speed on where we're at and what this is all about. And but they have the passion and the enthusiasm that we need, and the skills. So as Pete said.
Well, thank you. There are a couple of quick questions in the chat. Can you pay ahead for a natural burial? You know, we can go to Lansing's and we can prepay. Is that a possibility?
It's a possibility, but it's not a decision that we have made at this time. We haven't fully explored like all of the cemetery laws and that we're going to have to be dealing with. And some of those decisions we'll be making as a cemetery ourselves. So it's possible. I don't know if it's a done deal.
And if I can add in on that, a lot of times, like when I pre-plan people and they want to prepay their funeral, the cemetery stuff is usually separate anyway. They're doing that with the cemetery and the marker and things like that. So there'll probably be a natural division of that with your cemetery, I guess.
Okay. And then a couple people have asked if there's a place where there is a list of natural burial cemeteries in Iowa, and is there a list in Illinois?
This book is invaluable. It lists everything that was in across the country at the time of publication, and she's a journalist, she does periodic updates. Her name is Ann Hoffner, The Natural Burial Cemetery Guide. So in Iowa, there are no natural burial cemeteries at this time. There are hybrid situations, as I mentioned earlier, which is a conventional cemetery with a portion that has been allowed to be set aside for natural burial. How big those portions are, I have no idea, or the locations or the ideal aspects of it. But if it comes down to for you to just getting your body in the soil and having that you know, that natural relationship with the necrobiome, and that's the most important thing, and you're not that involved in the idea of a preserve and all of that, then you can probably find listing through the Green Burial Council, which has a website. They're a certifying body with a certain list of criteria of what constitutes green burial, and some of the hybrid cemeteries are choosing to get that certification, so they would be a source. Otherwise, it would just be contacting the cemetery that you're interested in and asking. I can tell you the two I know of, which is Oakland and Iowa City, and Cedar Memorial in Cedar Rapids has some areas for natural burial.
Okay, I'm also watching the time here, but Ken, go ahead.
I was just going to add in, there are a number of cemeteries that will allow that. There's one in Rochester. It's an old cemetery, beautiful wildflowers, and be careful when you walk because it's like waves, because they allow people to do natural burial, but you have to live in that township to go to that cemetery. And a lot of cemeteries are that way. You have to be a member of that church or live in that area or have family in that. So you run into restrictions when I've looked around, that there are places you can do it. It requires investigation.
And one last one, and then I'm going to turn it back over to Sue. Can natural burials be done in winter soil? In other words, when the ground is frozen?
Yes, there are a number of ways that people have addressed this issue. One is a jigsaw, cutting off the top layer of the soil that's frozen and kind of rolling it back. And then and then what's down below is typically easier to work with. In terms of like solid winter total freeze, naturopath uses a method that spreads charcoal briquettes over the portion that they're going to dig, sets them on fire, and then they cover it with just a big piece of sheet metal that they have. And as the briquettes burn through, it warms the soil and makes it quite doable, quite pliant. So yes, there are workarounds for that.
Okay, good.
Can I just
Well,
add?
you've,
Can I add real
Go ahead.
quickly? I know there were a couple of people that had their hands up. If you want to send your questions to Ken or to the Back to Ground email address, one
Right.
of us or all of us can try to get back to you on those.
Right. Both Ken and Back to Ground have put their email addresses in the chat. So if you have remaining questions, you can contact them. But I think since we're right up on 6:30, we need to probably close here. So Sue has some closing messages for us.
And I just want to mention there was one question at the very beginning addressed to Ken about how does one initiate a burial at sea? And I thought that was kind
Generally,
of
you're
an
better off
interesting
to go
question.
with like Neptune Society, somebody like that. What I do is if somebody wants to do that and they have a place, say California, and they want to go to a specific place, then I will call a funeral home there and ask them, who do you call when you do a burial at sea? So that's how when I'm investigating these things, we share information. It's just a logical way to pursue that. And there are other companies too, not just them, but they're probably the best known.
Okay. Well, in that case, I would like to get this wrapped up. Thank you to Ken, Becky, Pete, and Marion. I find all these new approaches to funerals just fascinating. And I also promised that I would let you know how you can help us with our goals to help others learn about Iowa laws and end-of-life choices. We have 2 local action teams that meet and plan on how to get information to the people of their communities by getting the CNC magazine and books on the topic of end-of-life issues into libraries, by doing live and online presentations, by tabling at farmers markets, conferences, and conventions, and anywhere people gather. One group is the Central Iowa Action Team, and the other is the Johnson County Action Team. Both groups meet regularly via Zoom, but are also starting to meet in person. 2 other groups I need to mention are the Legislative Work Group and the Community Education and Engagement Work Group. The first one of those, the Legislative Work Group, focuses on educating and influencing Iowa lawmakers with the goal of getting medical aid in dying bill introduced to and passed by the legislature. We have successfully gotten the bill introduced in both houses of the General Assembly on numerous occasions with helps of members of both houses. If you would like to learn about that group and enjoy engaging with our elected officials, please consider joining this group. Not my cup of tea, but whatever. The second group is the Community Education Engagement Group. This group is responsible for reaching out to the community via tabling, letter writing campaigns, live or virtual presentations, such as this one you're participating in right now. We also publish a newsletter every other month. If you're interested in meeting with and influence people of Iowa, either in person or by planning programs like this, then by all means join us. You can also contribute to the newsletter by passing on interesting items you found in the media asking questions in our Ask a Death Doula section, writing editorials or reviews of books or movies on the topic of end-of-life issues, or by suggesting Iowa volunteers that we could feature in our volunteer profile section. The first step to becoming a volunteer is to go to the CNC website and sign up. I'll put the URL in the chat right now. There you go. And also I have the email addresses of Steve Herwig, who leads the legislative group, and Marilyn Cruz from the Community Education and Engagement group. So if you're interested in joining one of those groups, you can contact them. You can also find us on Facebook on the Compassionate Choices Iowa page. That's Compassion and ampersand Choices Iowa on Facebook. So that's all for today's program. Thank you for attending.